Basili Alukos, U.S. Airways, and Delta are reporting earnings tomorrow. The street is expecting a profit from both companies, which is pretty extraordinary considering they are airlines. What are you expecting?
Yeah, you're right. Very extraordinary given that they are airlines. Pretty much consistent with what everyone else is expecting. Both companies, or at least all the airlines, report monthly traffic and capacity figures, so you have a sense of what revenue might come in line with. I know as far as Delta, there are a lot of moving targets there. They've been increasing the technology related to their flying. They also had that investment in Virgin Atlantic at the end of last fiscal year, so I'm sure they'll be working through structural costs related to that. And they've talked about increases for their pilot costs and salaries across the board. So I think looking at Delta, for me, it's most important to figure out whether or not they're able to maintain the revenue premium that they've generated over the past year, 2 years, relative to the rest of the industry. As far as U.S. Airways, obviously there'll be a lot of expenses related to the merger. For them, they've done a tremendous job since the 2008 downturn, cutting costs, becoming profitable. And for me, it's more of a question of what's going to happen with the merger integration going forward, not so much what the airline has done as a standalone entity.
What about this sequester and the FAA furloughs we keep hearing about? Do you think that the airlines will weigh in on those?
Yeah, I believe it may have been Delta. One or two of the airlines commented how some of the reduction in their volume was related to sequester. I kind of laugh at it, to be honest. If you think about the total workforce in the U.S. and then you think about, which is, call it 140 million or so, there aren't very many government employees. It's hard for me to imagine of the 750 million flights per year in the U.S. that so many of those are government related, and that a slowdown in government spending due to the sequester could have really impacted an airline. I'm sure they'll probably talk about it. As you know, the airlines are heavily regulated. It seems like there's always something going on with taxes, infrastructure. So for me, this is just more fodder for the airlines to talk about the negatives of regulation and the cost that's burdening all the carriers.
Well, you mentioned that the airlines have their structural problems sorted out, at least for the time being. But what about any exogenous shocks, whether it be a spike in oil or a bird flu? Are the airlines prepared for these?
I think they're more prepared than they have been in the past. At least if you look domestically at capacity, we're down, call it between 10 to 15% in the 2008 recession. If you include the U.S. Airways AMR merger, we now have the top 4 carriers representing about 80% of the domestic market versus, call it, 10 in the 2000s. So supply is intact. They've done a phenomenal job of cutting costs, removing redundancies, and they're a little bit better able to adjust to a downward called downward movement in demand, or as you talked about, the price of oil increasing. I think they're in a better shape to pass through those costs via higher pricing.